The sun hung high over downtown Manchester, New Hampshire, casting sharp shadows across the brick storefronts and old mill buildings that lined the street. It was one of those crisp fall afternoons where the air smells faintly of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and people seem just a little more alert, a little more alive. Outside the community center, a small stage had been set up under a white canopy, flanked by American flags and campaign banners. A modest crowd had gathered, some curious passers-by, a few local reporters, and a core group of supporters wearing matching blue t-shirts and holding signs that read, "Leadership You Can Trust." At the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt. She adjusted the lapel of her navy blazer, smoothed a strand of hair behind her ear, and took a slow breath before stepping up to the microphone. She wasn't new to this, far from it. As a former White House press aide, she'd stood in front of cameras more times than she could count, delivering crisp sound bites and fielding tough questions with a calm that often surprised people. Now, running for Congress in one of the most politically watched districts in the country, she carried that same poise like a second skin. Her smile was warm but measured, her voice clear and steady as she greeted the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her tone both friendly and firm. "I know your time is valuable, and I don't take that for granted." She spoke about jobs, about small businesses struggling to keep their doors open, about the rising cost of groceries and gas. She talked about border security, not with fiery rhetoric, but with a focus on orderly processes and national responsibility. The crowd nodded along. Her team, standing just off stage, exchanged quiet glances of approval. This was going exactly as planned. The live stream on her campaign's social media was already pulling in hundreds of viewers, comments scrolling by with thumbs-up emojis and words like, "Finally, someone who gets it." She moved into her section on national defense, a topic she'd prepared carefully. "Our military men and women put their lives on the line for us," she said, her voice softening just enough to show sincerity. "They deserve more than just our thanks. They deserve real support, better health care, stronger benefits, and leaders in Washington who actually listen." Applause rippled through the audience. A few people cheered. She let the moment linger, offering that familiar, confident smile, the one that had appeared in countless news clips and campaign ads. It was the kind of smile that said, "I've got this under control." Then from the front row, a voice cut through the fading claps. "Do they?" The word wasn't shouted. It wasn't angry, but it landed like a stone dropped into still water. Everyone turned. An older man stood near the edge of the stage. He wore a faded brown jacket, jeans, and a cap with the letters VFW stitched in gold thread above the brim. His face was lined with years, his eyes calm but direct. He didn't step forward aggressively, he just stood there, hands in his pockets, waiting. Karoline didn't miss a beat. "Yes," she replied smoothly, still smiling. "Absolutely," the man nodded slowly. "Then why did your endorsed budget proposal cut VA funding by 3% last year?" A hush fell over the crowd. Even the campaign staffer holding the livestream camera tilted it slightly, as if unsure whether to keep rolling. Karoline's smile didn't vanish, but it changed. It stayed on her lips, but her eyes narrowed just a fraction, the way someone's might when they're suddenly doing mental math in their head. She glanced toward her policy advisor in the wings, who gave a subtle shake of the head. "We didn't prep for this exact line." "I think there might be some confusion," Karoline said, choosing her words carefully. "That proposal was about reallocating resources to reduce waste and improve efficiency within the VA system." "Waste?" The man interrupted gently. "You call a 6-month wait for a PTSD appointment waste?" Now the crowd was completely still. No one shifted. No one whispered. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Karoline took a half-step closer to the edge of the stage.
"Sir, I respect your service, and I understand your frustration."
But policy isn't made in slogans. It's made in careful decisions that balance many needs. "I'm not asking for a slogan," he said. "I'm asking if you've ever sat across from a veteran who couldn't get help until it was too late." She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. For the first time in a long time, maybe the first time in her political career, she didn't have a ready-made answer. Her fingers brushed the edge of the podium just once, like she needed to feel something solid. The livestream counter kept climbing. Comments now read, "Who is this guy?" and "This is real." One viewer typed, "Finally, someone saying what we're all thinking." Her campaign manager gave a small, urgent gesture from the side. Wrap it up, move on. But Karoline didn't look away from the man. She exhaled almost imperceptibly, and her confident smile, the one that had carried her through press briefings and debate stages, faded into something quieter. More human I haven't, she admitted, voice lower now. But I should have. The words hung in the air, simple and unpolished. No spin, no pivot. Just honesty, raw and unexpected. The man studied her for a long moment. Then he gave a single nod, not approval exactly, but acknowledgement. He stepped back into the crowd without another word. The rally didn't collapse into chaos. There was no dramatic music, no slow-motion walk-off. Life didn't work like that. But something had shifted. The energy on the street felt different, less like a performance, more like a conversation that had just begun. Karoline cleared her throat and turned back to the microphone. "Let's talk more about what real support for veterans actually looks like," she said, her voice firmer now but stripped of its earlier polish. "Because clearly, we're not doing enough." And for the first time that day, the applause that followed didn't feel rehearsed. It felt earned. The moment the man stepped back into the crowd, the air didn't snap back to normal. It stayed thick, like the kind of quiet that follows a thunderclap, everyone waiting to see if another will come. Karoline didn't rush to fill the silence with another rehearsed line. Instead, she let it sit for a beat too long, long enough that people in the front row exchanged glances, unsure if the rally was still happening. Then she leaned slightly into the mic. "I'd like to hear more," she said, her voice softer than before but steady. "If you're willing to talk," the man paused. He looked around as if checking whether this was some kind of trap, a politician's trick to look humble while dodging real answers. But Karoline didn't gesture to her team or signal for a staffer to take over. She just stood there, hands resting lightly on the podium, waiting. After a few seconds, he nodded. "All right," he said. "My name's Tom. I served with the Marines in Iraq, first tour in 2004. Second in 2006, came home with a Purple Heart and a knee that still acts up when it rains." He spoke plainly, like he was telling a neighbor about his car trouble, not addressing a political candidate in front of a live audience. Karoline didn't interrupt. She listened. "I'm not here to make a scene," Tom continued. "I voted for folks on both sides of the aisle over the years. I don't care about your party pin. I care about whether you see us, people like me, not just on Veterans Day, but the other 364 days." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. A woman near the back called out, "My brother's been waiting 8 months for a hearing aid through the VA." Another voice added, "They lost his records twice." Karoline's expression shifted, not with defensiveness but with something closer to realization. She'd spent weeks refining her talking points on national security, quoting statistics about defense budgets and border staffing. But no one on her team had asked her to memorize the average wait time for mental health care at the Manchester VA clinic. No one had made her rehearse how to respond when a real person standing right in front of her said, "Your words don't match what we're living." "I hear you," she said finally. "And you're right. I haven't walked in your shoes. But I want to understand." Tom didn't smile. He didn't scowl either. He just looked at her, really looked like he was trying to decide if she meant it. "Then tell me this," he said. "When you say support our troops, do you mean the ones who came home and can't get a same-day appointment for depression? The ones working 2 jobs because their disability claim's been stuck in review for a year? Or do you mean the idea of them? The flag, the uniform, the photo op?" The question landed hard, not because it was loud but because it was precise. It cut through the usual political fog and pointed straight at the gap between symbol and substance. Karoline swallowed. She could have pivoted, said something about ongoing efforts or bureaucratic challenges beyond any one person's control. She'd been trained to do that. But something in Tom's eyes stopped her. It wasn't anger. It was weariness, the kind that comes from repeating the same truth over and over, only to be met with applause and empty promises. "I've used the phrase, 'support our troops,' too easily," she admitted. "And that's on me." A few people in the crowd blinked, surprised. Political candidates didn't usually say, "That's on me." They said mistakes were made or, "We're committed to improvement." But Karoline didn't hide behind passive voice. She owned it. Tom nodded slowly. "Good. Now what are you going to do about it?" She didn't have a 10-point plan ready. No glossy handout. But she didn't fake it either. "First," she said, I'll meet with local VA staff and veterans groups next week. Not for a photo, just to listen. Second, I'll go through every line of that budget proposal you mentioned and explain, publicly, what was cut, why, and whether it was the right call. And third, she paused, then added, I'll stop saying support our troops unless I can point to something real I've done to back it up. The crowd didn't erupt in cheers. But they didn't walk away either. They stayed, and that meant something. One of her campaign aides edged closer, phone in hand, clearly itching to end the segment and get back on script. But Karoline held up a finger, just one, and turned back to Tom. Can I ask you something? Sure. What would real support look like to you? Not in Washington, here in New Hampshire. Tom thought for a moment. Same-day mental health triage, faster processing for disability claims, and stop closing rural clinics. My buddy in Berlin drives 2 hours each way just to see a doctor who knows his file. She pulled a small notebook from her blazer pocket, real paper, not a tablet, and wrote it down, not for show. Her pen moved quickly, like she was trying to catch something before it slipped away. A local reporter who'd been filming on his phone lowered it slightly. Is this going to change your campaign priorities? He asked. Karoline looked up. It already has. The live stream comments had exploded. This feels different. Finally, a politician who doesn't talk down. Tom for Congress. Someone joked. But mostly, people were sharing their own stories about parents, siblings, friends who'd fallen through the cracks of a system that's supposed to catch them. As the rally wound down, Karoline didn't retreat to her SUV right away. She stayed on the sidewalk, shaking hands, answering questions without a teleprompter. When she passed Tom, she stopped. Thank you, she said quietly. He gave a small shrug. Don't thank me. Just do something, she nodded. And for the first time all day, her smile wasn't part of the performance. It was just human. Back in the campaign office that evening, the mood was tense. Some staff worried the unscripted exchange would hurt her strong leader image. Others argued it was the most authentic moment she'd had all cycle. But Karoline wasn't watching the spin. She was reading through VA reports, her coffee going cold on the desk. Meanwhile, Tom walked home, past the old mill buildings and under streetlights just starting to flicker on. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt tired, but also maybe a little hopeful. Not because he trusted politicians, but because for once someone had actually listened. And sometimes, that's where change begins, not with a grand speech, but with a single question asked and answered, in plain words on an ordinary afternoon. The clip spread faster than anyone expected. Not because it was dramatic or angry, but because it felt real. Like something you'd overhear at a diner booth or a bus stop, not a staged political moment. By the next morning, it had been shared thousands of times across social media. Local news stations looped the exchange between Karoline and Tom during their morning segments. One headline read, "Candidate stumbles, then listens." Another simply said, "What happens when a veteran asks a question no one else will?" But online buzz wasn't the only ripple. That same evening, an email landed in Karoline's inbox from a small veterans support group based in Concord. They'd seen the video. They appreciated her willingness to stay in the conversation. And they wanted to know, was she serious about meeting? She replied within the hour, "Yes, when works for you?" Her campaign team wasn't thrilled. This could open a can of worms, one advisor warned. Once you start making promises based on one interaction, people will expect you to fix everything overnight. But Karoline had already made up her mind. She'd spent years speaking in carefully calibrated phrases, always staying on message, always protecting the brand. But Tom hadn't asked for a brand. He'd asked for honesty, and she owed him and others like him more than a polished evasion. 2 days later, she walked into a modest community hall on the outskirts of town. No press, no banners, just folding chairs, a coffee pot in the corner, and about a dozen people seated in a loose circle. Most wore veteran caps or jackets with military patches. A few leaned on canes. One woman sat with a service dog curled quietly at her feet. Karoline didn't take a seat at the front. She pulled up a chair near the edge of the circle and introduced herself simply. "I'm Karoline. I'm running for Congress, and I'm here to listen." No one clapped. No one stood. But after a moment, a man with a thick New England accent spoke up. "You said you'd look into that budget cut. Did you?" She didn't flinch. "I did. And you were right. It did reduce certain VA administrative funds. The intention was to redirect money toward frontline care, but the way it was written created delays in processing claims. It wasn't malicious, but it was careless, and I should have asked harder questions before endorsing it. Silence followed. Not the awkward kind, but the thoughtful kind. The kind that comes when people realize you're not just reciting lines. Then the woman with the service dog spoke. My husband waited 14 months for a hearing about his exposure to burn pits. He died 2 weeks before the appointment. Her voice didn't break, but her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt. They sent us a letter afterward saying his file was incomplete. Karoline didn't offer condolences right away. She didn't say, "I'm so sorry for your loss," like it was a script. Instead, she looked the woman in the eye and said, "That shouldn't have happened. And it's unacceptable that it did." The room exhaled. Not because she'd solved anything, but because she hadn't tried to soften the truth. Over the next hour, stories poured out about lost paperwork, overworked VA counselors, rural clinics shuttered due to low utilization, which really meant hard to get to if you don't have a car or can't afford gas. One veteran described driving 3 hours, round trip just to refill a prescription because the local pharmacy stopped carrying his medication. Another talked about how hard it was to explain to his kids why he couldn't sleep through the night, why he jumped at loud noises, why sometimes he just sat in the garage for hours. Not saying much, Karoline took notes. Not for a speech later. Not for a campaign ad. Just notes. Names of facilities, specific policy gaps, suggestions for fixes that had worked in other states. At one point she asked, "If you could change one thing tomorrow, what would it be? Make the system see us as people," said a soft-spoken man in his 60s. Not case numbers. Not statistics. People. She wrote that down too. After the meeting, she sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine. Rain had begun to fall, light and steady, tapping against the windshield. She thought about all the times she'd spoken about our brave men and women in uniform during press briefings, how those words had rolled off her tongue like well-worn coins, familiar, shiny but weightless. Now those words felt heavy, because now they had faces, names, stories that didn't fit neatly into a 30-second soundbite. Back at campaign headquarters, she called an emergency strategy session, not to craft a response, but to rework her platform. "We're adding a full veterans healthcare plank," she told her team. Not just talking points. Real policy. Same-day mental health triage, mobile clinics for rural areas, a dedicated advocate in every VA office to help navigate claims. One staffer hesitated. "That's expensive, and it'll take time to implement." "I know," Karoline said, "but we're not running for office to maintain the status quo. We're running to fix what's broken." Meanwhile, Tom hadn't been online much since the rally. He wasn't looking for fame. He'd gone back to his routine, morning coffee at the same diner, tending to his garden, visiting his grandkids on weekends. But a neighbor stopped him in the hardware store. "Saw you on the news," he said with a grin. "You gave her a piece of your mind." Tom just shrugged. "I just asked a question." But that question had done more than rattle a candidate. It had opened a door. A few days later, Karoline's campaign posted a short video. Not polished, just her sitting at a kitchen table with a stack of VA reports. "After speaking with veterans across the district," she began, "I realize I got some things wrong. Here's what I'm changing and why." She didn't mention Tom by name, but those who'd seen the rally knew. The comments poured in again. This time, fewer jokes, more thank yous. One veteran wrote, "For once, I feel like someone's actually reading our letters." And in a quiet living room miles away, Tom watched the video with his granddaughter on his lap. She pointed at the screen. "Is that you, Grandpa?" He smiled faintly. That's just someone who finally listened. What started as a single moment of tension had become something else. Not a confrontation, but a connection. And in a world full of shouting matches and scripted outrage, that was rare enough to matter. The days after the veterans' meeting settled into a strange rhythm, quiet on the surface but humming with unseen movement underneath. Karoline didn't hold a press conference or drop a flashy policy rollout. Instead, she started showing up. Not with cameras, not with a slogan t-shirt, but with a notebook and a willingness to sit in folding chairs in church basements, VFW halls, and even a repurposed garage in Laconia. that served as an unofficial support space for vets who didn't feel comfortable walking into official offices. She listened more than she spoke. When she did talk, it wasn't about herself or her campaign. It was about what she'd heard. The frustration over lost paperwork, the exhaustion of repeating the same story to different clerks, the shame some felt asking for help at all. She met a former medic who now worked nights at a warehouse because his PTSD made daytime crowds unbearable. She spoke with a woman who'd served in logistics during the Afghanistan drawdown and now struggled to get her knee replacement approved, even though her service records clearly showed an in-theater injury. Each conversation chipped away at the polished armor she'd worn for so long. She still carried herself with confidence, but it was different now, less like a shield, more like a steady hand reaching out. Back in her campaign office, the tone had shifted too. Staffers who once measured success in retweets and poll bumps now tracked something quieter. How many veterans had called or emailed with new suggestions? How many local VA workers had reached out privately to say, finally, someone's asking the right questions? One policy advisor, who joined the campaign straight out of a DC think tank, admitted over coffee, "I thought I understood the system. I didn't." Meanwhile, Tom kept to himself. He wasn't looking for credit. He'd said his piece and gone back to his life, fixing his neighbor's porch railing, taking his dog for long walks in the woods behind his house, watching the geese fly south in ragged V formations. But then one afternoon his phone buzzed. It was a message from a fellow Marine he hadn't heard from in years. "Saw you on that clip. Proud of you, brother." Soon more messages came, from old squadmates, from strangers who'd served in other branches but recognized the same tired look in his eyes. The one that said, "I've been waiting to be seen." He didn't reply to most of them. But one evening after dinner, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea and typed out a short post on a local veterans forum. "Didn't go to that rally to make a scene. Just tired of hearing thank you for your service while waiting 6 months to talk to a counselor." Candidate listened. Didn't promise miracles. Just said she'd try. That's more than most. He hit post and walked outside to check on his tomato plants. He didn't expect much to come of it. But by morning, his post had been shared over 2,000 times. Not because it was fiery or clever, but because it was honest. Other vets added their own stories in the comments, some angry, some sad, some just tired. A few wrote, "Wish someone would ask me what I need instead of telling me what they think I want." One simply said, "We're not statues. We're people." Karoline saw the post. She didn't quote it in a speech or use it in an ad, but she printed it out and pinned it to the bulletin board above her desk, right next to the VA wait time reports and a hand-drawn map of rural clinics in the district. Her team started planning a town hall, not the usual kind with pre-screened questions and a teleprompter, but one co-hosted with a local chapter of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. No podium, no backdrop, just rows of chairs in a high school gym, open to anyone who wanted to come. No speeches, Karoline insisted. Just conversation. The night before the event, she stayed late at the office, reviewing notes from every veteran she'd spoken to. Her coffee had gone cold again. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across the empty parking lot. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about optics or messaging. She was thinking about Tom's question. "Do you mean the one still waiting?" She did now. Across town, Tom got an email invitation to the town hall. He almost deleted it. He wasn't big on crowds, and he didn't trust political theater. But then he remembered the way Karoline had looked at him that day. Not past him, not through him, but right at him like he mattered. So he printed the email, folded it into his jacket pocket, and told his grandkids he'd be out for a few hours the next evening. The day of the town hall, rain threatened but never fell. The gym filled slowly at first, then steadily. Veterans in uniform and plain clothes, spouses holding hands, a few younger faces who'd recently returned from overseas. Karoline arrived early, not through a back entrance but through the front doors, greeting people as they came in. She didn't shake hands like it was a photo op. She made eye contact. She remembered names. When the event began, she didn't take the center chair. She sat in the circle just like at the earlier meeting. And when the first question came, what happens when the election's over and no one's watching anymore? She didn't give a rehearsed line about commitment. She said, "Then I'll keep showing up." Even when it's not on camera, no one clapped right away. But then one by one, people started nodding. Later that night, as Karoline drove home, her phone buzzed again. It was a text from her policy lead. VA director just called. Wants to meet next week. Says your outreach shook something loose. She smiled. Not the confident, camera-ready smile from the rally, but a small, tired one that carried relief, not performance. And miles away, Tom sat on his porch wrapped in a flannel shirt, watching the stars come out. His dog lay at his feet. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something had shifted, just enough to make the waiting feel a little less lonely. The town hall didn't end with a standing ovation or a viral clip. It ended with people lingering afterward, talking in small groups, some shaking Karoline's hand, others just nodding as they passed by. A few stayed to ask follow-up questions, quiet, practical things like, will your plan cover transportation to appointments? Or what about vets who don't qualify for full benefits but still can't afford care? She answered each one plainly without the usual political padding. No, I'll look into that. Just, yes, here's how, or that's a gap we missed, I'll fix it. Tom sat in the back row the whole time, arms crossed, saying nothing. He wasn't there to speak. He was there to see if she'd changed her tune once the cameras weren't rolling. But as the evening wore on, he noticed something. She kept referring to things people had told her in private meetings. The name of a closed clinic in Berlin, the story of the veteran who drove 3 hours for a prescription, the woman whose husband died waiting for his burn pit claim. She wasn't reciting a script. She was remembering. Afterward, as people filed out, Karoline spotted him near the exit. She walked over, not with a politician's practiced stride, but with the slight hesitation of someone who wasn't sure she'd earned the right to say thank you again. You came, she said. I wanted to see if you meant it, he replied. And, he looked at her for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corners of his mouth lifted. You're still listening. That's a start. It wasn't praise. It wasn't an endorsement. But it was enough. In the weeks that followed, the campaign didn't pivot back to safe, broad topics. Instead, Karoline doubled down. She visited the Manchester VA Medical Center unannounced, not for a photo op, but to sit in the waiting room and talk to patients. She met with VA clerks who worked overtime just to keep up with backlogged files. She even rode along with a mobile health unit that traveled to remote parts of the district, bringing basic care to towns too small for a full clinic. Her policy team drafted a detailed veterans healthcare plan, not full of vague promises, but specific actions, hiring more mental health counselors, creating a digital portal so veterans could track their claims in real time, restoring funding to rural outreach programs. Most importantly, the plan included a provision for an independent ombudsman in every VA facility, a person whose only job was to help veterans cut through red tape, no matter how long it took. When she released the full proposal, she didn't stand on a stage. She posted a plain video from her kitchen table just like before. This isn't perfect, she said, but it's built from your voices, not mine, and I'll keep updating it as long as people are willing to tell me what's missing. The response wasn't just from veterans. Local doctors, nurses, even small-town mayors reached out to offer support. One retired VA administrator wrote, I've worked in this system for 30 years. This is the first time a candidate has asked what actually breaks and how to fix it. Election day came and went. The results were close, as expected in that district. But regardless of the outcome, something had already changed. Not in headlines or polls, but in the quiet spaces where real life happens, in waiting rooms, in kitchen conversations, in the way people looked at each other when the word veteran came up. Karoline didn't win by a landslide, but she won, and on the night of her victory speech, she stood not in a ballroom full of donors but back in that same community center where it all began. The stage was smaller this time. No banners. Just a mic, a few folding chairs, and a crowd that included more than a few familiar faces from the VA meetings. She didn't talk about mandates or momentum. She started by saying, a few months ago, a man asked me a question I couldn't answer, and that question changed everything. She didn't name Tom. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew. I used to think leadership meant having all the answers, she said. Now I know it means having the courage to admit when you don't, and the humility to listen until you do. After the speech, Tom didn't stick around for the celebration. He walked home under a sky full of stars, the same way he always did. But this time his steps felt a little lighter. Not because everything was fixed, far from it, but because someone had finally stopped talking over the problem and started walking alongside it. Weeks later, as Karoline prepared to head to Washington, she made one last stop before packing her bags. She drove to a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town and knocked on a familiar door. Tom answered, holding a mug of coffee. "I'm not here to ask for anything," she said, "just to say thank you. And to let you know, the first bill I introduce will be about VA wait times. And I'd be honored if you'd read the draft before I file it." He studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in, coffee's hot." They sat at his kitchen table, just two people, no titles, no cameras, no script. And for the first time in a long time, the conversation wasn't about politics. It was about people. In the end, the story wasn't about a candidate who stumbled or a veteran who spoke up. It was about what happens when someone chooses to listen, and when someone else chooses to believe they might actually hear. Not every problem got solved, not every promise was kept overnight, but trust once broken had begun to mend. And sometimes that's the most powerful victory of all.